They said Ezekiel Mercer once pointed a shotgun at a widow who crossed onto his land by mistake and made her turn around barefoot in the snow. They said no woman had stepped inside his ranch house in 10 years. Not since the night his wedding ended in betrayal and blood. Folks in the Wyoming territory called him half ghost, half madman, a rancher so buried in silence that even the mountains seemed quieter around him. But the story people remembered years later was not about the man who shut the world out. It was about the night a stubborn woman knocked on his door during a dust storm, and instead of sending her away, Ezekiel Mercer stepped aside and said 4 words no one ever thought would leave his mouth again. Get inside before you die. Long before Rose Bennett reached his ranch, she had already learned what loneliness tasted like. It tasted like cold coffee beside dying campfires, like sleeping with one hand on a revolver beneath broken wagons, like pretending grief hurt less if you never stayed anywhere long enough to remember what happiness felt like. She rode into the Wyoming hills beneath a bruised autumn sky, with dust coating her boots and exhaustion pulling at her shoulders, guiding her limping horse along a narrow trail carved between dry cliffs and dead cedar trees. Rose had spent the last 3 years drifting from ranch to ranch, breaking horses and earning just enough money to keep moving. Some women searched for husbands. Some searched for safety. Rose searched for distance, from memories, from promises, from the man she once loved who had died with hatred in his heart and a bullet in his chest during a cattle war that never should have happened. She carried little with her now beyond a bedroll, a saddlebag of supplies, and the quiet determination to survive another winter alone. Earlier that afternoon, she'd stopped in a small frontier town where every conversation seemed to pause the moment she mentioned the Mercer Ranch trail. One old stable hand had spat tobacco into the dirt and muttered, "That mountain belongs to a dead man who ain't buried yet." Another warned her Zeke Mercer hated strangers worse than snakes. Rose had rolled her eyes at all of it. Men in western towns loved turning wounded cowboys into legends. Still, as the sky darkened and the wind sharpened, she began wondering if perhaps the stories had teeth after all. The storm came fast. One moment the hills stood dry and empty beneath fading sunlight, and the next the entire valley disappeared behind violent walls of dust and screaming wind. Her horse panicked beneath her, stumbling sideways as thunder cracked somewhere overhead. Rose fought to calm the animal, but a loose stone shifted beneath its front leg, and the horse collapsed hard onto one knee with a cry of pain. Rose hit the ground shoulder first, sliding across rough dirt as sharp gravel tore open her palms. For several seconds, she couldn't breathe. Dust filled her mouth and eyes while the wind howled through the canyon like something alive. By the time she forced herself upright, her horse was trembling badly, favoring its injured leg. The nearest town sat miles behind her. Night was coming quickly, and somewhere beyond the rising storm sat the ranch belonging to the loneliest man in Wyoming. Rose led the horse through the darkening hills with bloody hands wrapped in torn cloth, following a barely visible fence line until she finally spotted lantern light flickering through the storm. The ranch appeared suddenly out of the dust like something abandoned by the world itself. A weather-beaten house, a wide barn, cattle pens creaking in the wind, and mountains towering behind it like silent guards. No smoke rose from the chimney. No welcoming light glowed from the windows. The entire place looked less like a home and more like a fortress built for one man determined never to be found. Rose climbed the porch steps with exhaustion dragging at every bone in her body and knocked hard against the wooden door just as thunder shook the valley. Nothing happened at first. Then heavy footsteps crossed the floor inside. The door opened halfway, revealing the broad frame of a man holding a rifle loosely in one hand. Ezekiel Mercer looked exactly like the rumors described him. Tall, rough-faced, dark beard touched with early gray, eyes colder than mountain rivers, and a scar cutting across his jaw like an old lightning strike. He studied her without speaking, his expression unreadable except for irritation at finding another human being on his property. "You lost?" he asked flatly. Rose straightened despite the pain in her shoulder. "Horse is injured. Storm caught me halfway through the pass." His eyes dropped briefly to the blood soaking through the cloth around her hand. "Town's south." "I know where town is." "Then keep riding." Under any other circumstances Rose might have cursed him and walked away out of sheer pride. But another violent gust nearly knocked her sideways, and her horse let out a weak, pained sound behind her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Zeke's expression remained hard, guarded, like a man already regretting opening the door at all. Then his gaze shifted toward the injured horse standing in the storm. Something changed in his eyes, not softness exactly, but recognition. He stepped past her without another word, crouched beside the horse's injured leg, and checked the swollen joint with experienced hands. "Animal won't survive the night out there," he muttered. Rose crossed her arms tightly against the cold. "Neither will I." Zeke looked at her again, longer this time, as though trying to decide whether helping her was worth reopening some wound he had spent years sealing shut. Then he exhaled sharply through his nose and stepped aside from the doorway. "Get inside before you die." The warmth of the ranch house hit Rose the moment she entered, carrying the scent of cedar smoke, leather, and something painfully unfamiliar after years alone. Home. The place was clean but stripped of comfort, almost untouched by life. One table, one chair pulled out beside the fireplace. No photographs, no laughter, no evidence another soul had existed there in years. Zeke took her coat silently and hung it near the fire before disappearing toward the barn to tend her horse. Rose stood alone in the quiet house listening to the storm batter the walls outside, unsure why the sound of another person moving through the darkness unsettled her more than the loneliness ever had. Later that night, after cleaning and bandaging her torn hands herself because Zeke barely spoke enough to offer help, she noticed a folded wool blanket waiting outside the bedroom door alongside a tin cup of hot coffee. No explanation, no kindness attached to it. Just quiet care from a man who clearly did not remember how to show it openly anymore. Rose sat on the edge of the narrow bed staring at the blanket for a long moment while thunder rolled through the mountains beyond the ranch. Somewhere outside, she could hear Zeke working alone in the barn long after midnight. And though neither of them understood it yet, the silence surrounding that lonely ranch had already begun to change the moment she knocked on the door. By the third morning, Rose Bennett realized the strange thing about loneliness was how quickly a person noticed its absence. For 3 years she had slept beneath wagons, in crowded boarding houses, beside dying campfires, and once in an abandoned church with snow blowing through broken windows. Yet somehow the quiet ranch belonging to Ezekiel Mercer unsettled her more than any of those places ever had. Not because it felt dangerous, but because it no longer felt empty. The first morning after the storm, she woke expecting Zeke to demand she leave immediately. Instead, she found him outside before sunrise repairing her saddle beneath the barn lantern while frost clung to the fence posts and steam rolled from the horses' backs in the cold mountain air. He barely acknowledged her presence when she stepped into the barn wrapped in the old wool coat he had loaned her, though she noticed his eyes briefly lift toward her to make sure the bandages on her hands remained clean. "Horse needs another 2 days before travel," he said simply, tightening a leather strap. Legs swollen. Rose leaned against the barn doorway watching him work. "You always this cheerful in the mornings?" Zeke grunted something that might have been irritation or amusement. It was difficult telling the difference with him. Over the next several days, an unspoken rhythm quietly formed between them, one neither acknowledged aloud because doing so would make it real. Rose cooked meals because she claimed Zeke's coffee tasted like burnt dirt and his stew looked poisonous. Zeke repaired her wagon harness and reshod her horse without asking for payment. During the afternoons, they worked side by side mending damaged fencing left ruined by the storm, their conversations sharp and brief at first, like two people testing how close they could stand without getting burned. Rose discovered Zeke hated unnecessary questions, spoke more easily to animals than people, and carried sadness the way some men carried old war injuries, silently, constantly, and deep enough that even breathing around it seemed painful. Yet she also noticed things that did not fit the monster described in town stories. Every morning before breakfast, Zeke climbed the hill behind the barn carrying scraps of meat to feed an injured hawk nesting among the rocks. He pretended not to notice stray dogs gathering near the porch during cold nights, though Rose caught him leaving food outside for them after dark. Once, while repairing fence posts together, Rose sliced her palm open on rusted wire and swore loudly enough to echo through the valley. Before she could react, Zeke grabbed her wrist instinctively and wrapped the wound with his own bandana, his rough hands surprisingly careful. The moment lasted only seconds, But neither spoke afterward because something dangerous had passed silently between them, something warmer than attraction and far more frightening. That evening, Rose sat across from him at the kitchen table while rain tapped softly against the windows, watching the lantern light catch the scar along his jaw. "You know," she said casually while stirring coffee, "folks in town act like you buried bodies behind this house." Zeke didn't look up from sharpening a knife. "Maybe I did. See, that right there explains why nobody visits." To her surprise, the corner of his mouth twitched slightly. It was not quite a smile, but close enough to startle her. "Thought you were leaving once the storm passed," he muttered. Rose shrugged, horse still limping. But neither of them mentioned how the weather had already cleared enough for travel. Later that night, unable to sleep, Rose wandered quietly through the ranch house while wind rattled softly against the windows. She noticed a closed door at the end of the hallway she had never seen open before. Something about it felt different from the rest of the house, not abandoned, exactly, but preserved. After hesitating several seconds, she slowly turned the handle. Dust drifted through, moonlight spilling from a narrow window inside. The room looked frozen in time. Folded white fabric rested across a chair beside dried flowers crumbling inside old jars. A wooden archway decoration leaned against the far wall beneath layers of dust, still wrapped with faded ribbons. And hanging carefully beside the wardrobe was a wedding dress. Rose stood motionless. 10 years of silence suddenly made terrible sense. She heard floorboards creak behind her and turned to find Zeke standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable except for the tension tightening his shoulders. For a long moment neither spoke. "You shouldn't be in here," he said quietly. Rose swallowed hard. "I didn't know." Zeke looked past her toward the dress without truly seeing it. "Wasn't your business to know." His tone carried no anger, only exhaustion. Rose stepped aside slowly. "You gonna tell me what happened?" He remained silent long enough that she thought he might walk away entirely. Instead, he leaned one shoulder against the doorframe and stared into the room like a man trapped outside his own past. 10 years ago, he said flatly, "this ranch belonged to my father. Biggest spread in the territory. My younger brother and I ran cattle together." His jaw tightened. "I was supposed to get married 3 days before Christmas." Rose listened quietly while thunder rumbled faintly beyond the mountains. "Night before the wedding," he continued, "my brother and my fiancée signed the ranch over to a railroad investor behind my father's back. Planned on selling the land and disappearing together once papers cleared." Rose felt her chest tighten. "Your father?" Zeke's eyes darkened. "Had a stroke after finding out. Died 2 weeks later." Silence filled the hallway. "I nearly killed my brother the night he came back for the remaining money." His voice lowered dangerously. "Would have too if my mother hadn't stood between us." Rose suddenly understood why the townsfolk looked at Zeke Mercer the way they did. Not because he was cruel, but because pain had hollowed him out so completely there was barely room for anything else afterward. "So you came up here alone," she said softly. "Rebuilt everything from nothing." Zeke gave a humorless laugh. Wasn't much else left to do. For the first time since arriving, Rose saw the man beneath the silence clearly. Not some cold-hearted rancher hiding from the world, but someone who once loved deeply enough that betrayal destroyed the shape of his entire life. And perhaps what unsettled her most was realizing she understood that kind of loneliness better than she wanted to admit. Zeke finally pushed himself away from the doorway. "Get some sleep," he muttered. "Long ride once your horse heals." But when he turned to leave, Rose spoke before she could stop herself. "You laughed yesterday." He paused. "What? At dinner?" She folded her arms lightly. "Might have been accidental, but I heard it." Zeke stared at her as though she'd pointed out something private he hadn't realized anyone could still see. Then, to her complete shock, he actually smiled. Small, tired, crooked, but real. "Don't get used to it," he said quietly before disappearing down the hallway. Rose stood alone outside the forgotten wedding room listening to his footsteps fade through the silent house, suddenly aware that somewhere between the storm, the long days working beside him, and the quiet kindness hidden beneath his rough edges, Ezekiel Mercer no longer felt like a stranger. And deep down, that frightened her more than the storm ever had. By the time Wallace Grady's riders appeared openly along the ridge above the Mercer ranch, Rose Bennett already knew she was no longer deciding whether to stay, only whether she was willing to admit she had nowhere else she wanted to go. Dawn spread pale gold across the Wyoming hills as 6 armed men on horseback stopped near the outer fence line, like wolves circling a wounded animal. From the porch, Rose watched Ezekiel Mercer lean silently against one of the wooden posts beside her, his jaw tight beneath the shadow of his hat, while the cold morning wind rolled through the valley. Neither of them spoke at first. The stillness between them had changed over the past week. It no longer felt empty. It felt full of things neither dared say aloud. "Friends of yours?" Rose asked quietly. Zeke's eyes never left the riders. "No." One of the men kicked open the damaged fence gate and rode several yards closer before stopping. "Mr. Grady says you're harboring stolen property," the rider shouted. "And a woman who ought to know better than to hide in these hills." Rose felt anger tighten inside her chest. Zeke rested one hand calmly near the revolver on his hip. "Tell Grady if he wants something from my land," he called back evenly. "He can grow brave enough to come ask himself." The rider smirked coldly. "He's giving you one chance, Mercer." Zeke's expression hardened into something dangerous enough that even Rose felt the temperature shift beside him. "And I'm giving you one chance to ride off my property before I bury you on it." For several tense seconds nobody moved. Then the rider spat into the dirt and turned his horse sharply, leading the others back toward the ridge. Rose waited until they disappeared before exhaling slowly. "That probably could have gone better." "Probably. You always threaten people before breakfast?" "Only the rude ones." Despite the danger hanging over them, Rose found herself laughing softly, and to her surprise Zeke's mouth almost twitched again in response. But the warmth vanished quickly. By noon, they discovered 2 horses released from the north pen and part of the barn roof deliberately damaged. Grady was no longer hiding his intentions. Rose helped Zeke hammer boards in a place while storm clouds gathered over the mountains once more, the air thick with tension neither of them could ignore. "This is my fault," she finally said while climbing down from the ladder beside him. "Grady's after me, not you." Zeke kept working without looking at her. "Doesn't matter." "It should." He struck another nail hard enough to split the wood. "You think I'd let those men drag you off because it's inconvenient?" Rose folded her arms tightly. "I think you've spent 10 years trying not to care about anybody, and now you're about to get yourself killed because you forgot how." That finally made him stop. Zeke turned toward her slowly, eyes dark beneath the brim of his hat. "No," he said quietly. "I remember exactly how." The words hit harder than shouting would have. Rose looked away first because suddenly the space between them felt too small to breathe inside. That night, the attack came just after midnight. Rose woke to horses screaming outside and the sharp crack of gunfire echoing through the valley. She rushed from bed to find flames climbing one side of the barn, while cattle panicked violently inside their pens. Zeke was already outside firing toward shadows moving beyond the fence line. "Stay in the house," he shouted as another bullet shattered the water barrel beside the porch. Rose ignored him immediately, grabbing buckets and racing toward the flames. Smoke poured into the freezing air while terrified horses kicked against their stalls inside the burning barn. Zeke cursed under his breath when he saw her running toward the fire instead of away from it. "Rose, I'm not letting those animals burn." Together they fought through smoke and chaos, throwing water against the spreading flames while bullets occasionally tore through the darkness around them. At one point, a burning beam crashed down near the stable entrance, trapping Rose briefly beneath falling debris. Before she could react, Zeke charged directly through the fire, dragged the beam aside with bare hands, and pulled her violently against him as part of the roof collapsed where she had been standing seconds earlier. For one suspended moment, everything else disappeared. The gunfire, the smoke, the storm overhead. Rose stared up at him through ash and firelight while his arms remained wrapped tightly around her like he could not physically bear letting go. "You could have died," he breathed hoarsely. Rose's heart hammered painfully against her ribs. "So could you." Another gunshot cracked through the night, snapping them back to reality. The fighting lasted nearly an hour before Grady's men finally retreated into the hills after realizing Zeke would rather die than surrender the ranch or the woman standing beside him. By dawn, the fire was extinguished, though part of the barn remained blackened and ruined. Exhausted and injured, Zeke sat heavily against the porch steps while Rose cleaned a deep burn across his forearm with trembling hands. Neither spoke for several minutes. Then, very softly, Rose asked, Why did you really let me stay that first night? Zeke stared out across the smoking valley. Truth. Always. His voice lowered almost to a whisper. Because when I opened that door, you looked just as lonely as I was. Something inside Rose finally broke open completely. She set the cloth aside and looked at him. Not the feared rancher people whispered about. Not the broken man hiding from his past. But the person who silently repaired saddles before sunrise, fed injured birds, gave up his bed without complaint, and walked through fire to save her without hesitation. I stopped planning to leave days ago, she admitted shakily. Zeke turned toward her slowly. Rose swallowed hard, emotions catching painfully in her throat. Somewhere between the arguing and the coffee and watching you pretend not to care about anything. She laughed weakly through tears, threatening her eyes. I fell in love with you, Zeke. For a moment, he simply stared at her like a man hearing words he thought belonged to someone else's life. Then his rough hand lifted carefully to her face, touching her cheek with astonishing gentleness. Rose. But before he could finish, she kissed him. The sunrise spilled gold across the ruined ranch while years of silence finally shattered between them. Weeks later, Wallace Grady was arrested after evidence of his land crimes reached the territorial marshal, and the danger hanging over the valley finally disappeared. Yet even after peace returned, Rose noticed Zeke growing distant again, haunted by the violence he had nearly unleashed during the attack. One cold morning before dawn, she found him saddling a horse quietly outside the barn. You leaving? She asked from behind him. Zeke didn't turn around immediately. Thought maybe you deserved someplace better than this. Rose walked toward him slowly. Better than what? A man who solves problems with a gun. That's not the man I know. He finally faced her, pain visible beneath his calm expression. You don't know what's inside me. Rose reached up, removed the rifle from his saddle, and set it aside firmly. No, she said softly. I know exactly what's inside you. That's why I'm still here. Zeke looked at her for a long moment before something inside him finally gave way completely. Months later, spring returned to the Wyoming hills, and the Mercer ranch no longer felt haunted. Workers filled the barns with laughter. Horses thundered across open fields. Music drifted from the porch at night. And standing beside the corral beneath warm afternoon sunlight, Rose watched Ezekiel Mercer, smiling openly, while teaching a young ranch hand how to mend tack properly. A traveler, passing through the valley, glanced toward Zeke before asking quietly, "Is it true that rancher didn't let a woman near this land for 10 years?" Rose smiled to herself as Zeke looked up toward the house, his expression softening the instant he saw her standing there. "It's true," she answered gently. Then she looked back toward the man who had once closed himself off from the entire world and added, "Right up until the day he opened the door."